Welcome back to our Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Joy Votrobek, and back with me today is our senior fellow, Alan Dowd. Welcome back, Alan.
Good to be here as always, Joy.
Thank you. Today, Alan, I would like to talk to you about your July article titled Threats Abroad and Worries at Home. Alan, you speak to the main regional threats from Putin's war in Ukraine to President Xi's constant threats to the international liberal order, both in the Philippines, Taiwan, North Korea and Japan situation, North Korea providing Russia aid, and Iranian threats to democracy, specifically Israel. You said if they are not put in check, they will surely grow. So could you remind our listeners about a similar series of events that led up to World War II and your thoughts on how we might deter further escalation?
Sure. It's to me, it's a good news, bad news, or a worrisome / calming situation. And I'll put it this way. The bad news is these are threats to what we call the liberal international order, the post-war order, the way the world has worked since 1945, whatever term we want to use. These three nodes of power, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, and then their vassals, are pushing against that order that has worked and has served our interests, America's interests, more than or as much as anyone else's. But they're pushing against that violently. Of course, in the case of Russia, it's happening with basically a traditional kind of warfare, the largest war in Europe since 1945. Iran using mostly proxies and hybrid operations. It's what they call the ring of resistance around Israel, the Hamas, Houthis, Hezbollah, and just really putting every part of Israel under threat. And then, of course, China has not taken military action. I'll put an asterisk on that with Taiwan and the Philippines, but has illegally claimed and militarized islands in the South China Sea that are not in Chinese territorial waters. And as you and I think all our listeners know, when you conduct a air, missile, and naval exercises around an island, you effectively blockade that island, and that's an act of war. China's done that to the Taiwanese many times over the last 20 months or so, different war games or exercises effectively blockading Taiwan. And then the Chinese Coast Guard vessels have attacked Philippine Coast Guard and naval vessels. So maybe those three are distinct right now, but there's great connective tissue between them. We know, as you mentioned in the run-up a moment ago, that the Chinese are supplying huge numbers of dual-use technologies to Russia, buying a lot of Russian oil, which helps underwrite Russia. Of course, North Koreans sending shells to Russia, which North Korea is a proxy of and a vassal of China. And then, of course, the Iranians sending kamikaze drones to Russia. And then the Russians working with to help Iran get new technology. So there's a lot of connective tissue. That's not an alliance. I think it's fair to call it an axis, as I have, and I think as you have. I use the term axis of autocracy. That's all the bad news. And the second part of that bad news is an extra spark here or there could kind of allow this to mutate into a larger, more than three regional wars or more than three regional conflicts, three regional issues. The good news is, unlike in 1938, 39, and by the fact the United States wasn't part of the discussion really until 1940, 41, the free world is awake to this danger and is moving against it. We saw in April the free world several allies of Israel rose to the occasion to help Israel literally ward off a massive missile attack. The Americans and the Germans and the French and the British helping in different ways Israel in its war of self-defense. Of course, the biggest example of the free world stepping up is in Ukraine. All NATO members plus another 20 or so non-NATO members, part of a group that is pouring aid, economic and military, into Ukraine to help Ukraine fight a war of self-defense and a war of existence in that case. And the free world is waking up to the issue. Finally, in Taiwan, you see numbers of European leaders talk about Taiwan. You've seen signals and even some words from the Japanese about there's no way that we would allow the United States to fight for Taiwan alone if Taiwan's attacked. And you see the United States and Japan and South Korea and Australia working closer and closer, ever closer together to help deter war. The British, the Americans and Australians involved in an alliance within an alliance, AUKUS, as you know. So it's a good news, bad news thing. And the worriers might say, well, this looks like World War, antecedent to another World War. The ones who might caution calm could say, well, no, there's some mitigating factors here. There's some things that might prevent that. And that's part of what I talked about here. There's a lot of threats abroad. There's a lot of worries in this July essay that I wrote. And then the August issue, I'll talk about how the free world is trying to address those. And I just kind of gave your listeners a hint about all that.
And you kind of walked into my next point, too. And we do have a lot of good alliances, and like you just mentioned, Japan, Australia, and South Korea all working together and trying to help Ukraine. But you also talk in your paper about a retreat of freedom on a global scale and the increased risks and costs to America and its allies.
Yeah.
Why do you believe that we're seeing a retreat from freedom and a move toward more about Marxism or authoritarianism?
Well, the retreat is being tracked and reported on by Freedom House, which is a wonderful research organization, think tank, and the numbers are fairly grim. 39% of the world's people live in countries rated not free. Only 20% live in free countries. We've seen 17 consecutive years in a decline in free government. There was a great wave of freedom from about 1987 over the following 15, 17, almost 2 decades. But now that wave has clearly hit its height and started to ebb. Why is it happening? I think the autocratic powers, the dictators, in a sense, were on their heels and got their act together in some cases. In some cases, countries that were teetering between freedom and autocracy leaned the wrong way, leaned back toward autocracy. And the case, the most, and when that happens with a big country that has geographic or power projecting influence like Russia, that has a big effect. And so when Russia was moving, some would say limping at times, but it was moving in the right direction toward a free constitutional government, that was good for the world situation with freedom, for global freedom. And as Russia fell away from that and then finally turned completely back toward dictatorship, that had an effect on global freedom. So I would say that's one reason. Another reason is that the other big node of power on the autocratic side is China. You got Russia and China. China, as you and I think all our listeners know, was certainly not making progress toward a free constitutional government in the late 80s and early 90s, but it was opening up to principles of more free market economics. It was opening up and allowing there to be pockets of religious freedom, certainly not what the West would say is a definition, but it was much different than under Xi. And it kept its hands off Hong Kong, which was an exponent of economic freedom, and the closest thing to political freedom in China was Hong Kong. But under Xi,
sorry, that the U.S.
Go
was
ahead.
hoping that opening would lead to more of a democratic state.
Exactly. It was a multiple administrations, bipartisan, believed that this was part of the pathway or the stair steps towards China coming in to be a member of the community of nations and to be peacefully reformed. But that Xi has stopped that and reversed that. So you have these two nodes of power. One never got past the freedom finish line in the case of Russia, and China stopped its move toward that. And I think that's had a big impact. And then the case of Iran, it's a revolutionary regime. It's always said it's a revolutionary regime and opposes freedom in all its forms and has been trying to export its revolution and undermine the global order since the revolution of '79. So no surprise there. So I think that's some of the reasons. I think maybe internally the free world maybe didn't devote as much resources or time or effort to shoring up its base, or it's bolstering the front lines of freedom, as you might say. I think countries like Ukraine needed more help, and we didn't give it. Countries like Taiwan right now, there's a $19 billion backlog of defensive weapon systems that Taiwan has wanted and asked for and have been promised, and we haven't gotten them to them. These kinds of things have effects, have consequences, So I think the whole constellation of things, but those are some of the reasons I think that this might have happened.
In hearing you speak specifically about China and President Xi and what he's accomplishing now and his moves and the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, I was thinking to myself as you're talking, maybe that has a pretty big impact globally on other countries. I know he's got his hands on a lot of different ports and overland routes and money pouring into these countries.
Well, that's a very good point, Joy. You have to, and that really underscores what I was saying a moment ago, that when you have a big country that is demographically large, has power projecting capabilities, has a big checkbook in the case of China, if it is teetering or moving or embracing the hard autocracy, it's going to have an effect in a negative way on the cause of freedom around the world. And definitely China with its checkbook diplomacy, it has China doesn't care about human rights and those kinds of things, so it doesn't mind dealing with any kind of partner around the world. And then those partners give it toeholds, and those partners give it toeholds in places like Africa or South Asia, and that has an impact on the cause of freedom.
It's hard for the U.S. to compete when we don't want to be a part of countries that don't have transparency or they have human rights issues, and China just doesn't care.
Exactly, it's a lot easier to if you're in China's case to conduct foreign policy when you don't have any scruples, right? And you don't have to be concerned about human rights, religious liberty, how governments treat their people, corruption issues, et cetera, et cetera. So that is something in the Belt and Road Initiative, and the checkbook diplomacy is obviously having an impact with China.
Well, hopefully we can see some reversals in that. But Freedom House, we were talking about, said warns that democracies are being harmed from within by illiberal forces aiming to corrupt and shatter the very institution that keep the free world free.
Mm-hmm.
And I bring that up because in yesterday's newspaper, and I want to go back to also what you were saying with Iran, U.S. intelligence says Iran meddling in Gaza protests. And we're seeing this all across, our universities and in Washington, But he said, I want to be, in this article, he says, I want it to be clear that I know Americans who participate in protests are, in good faith, expressing their views on the conflict in Gaza, Haynes said in a statement. But it is also important to warn of foreign actors who seek to exploit our debate for their own purposes. So,
Alan, and that was the CIA statement, is that right? Or
yes,
one of the
correct.
Intelligence agencies?
Intelligence agency, yes.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to ask you from your paper what you think. Do you think a lot of what we're seeing is misinformation campaigns by foreign actors who want to divide us from within, or is there more to it than that?
I do. I think a lot of it is. There's always in a big transcontinental country like the United States, we have 330 million plus people, and there'll always be an element or fringe or marginal elements that have fringe or marginal views, and as long as they express those peacefully, that's okay in America. The majority can deal with that. When there is external support for that or external funding for that, that becomes a concern whenever those kinds of views are expressed violently, and it moves from the realm of words to actions, and even words themselves can actually be dangerous in some cases. I know people don't like hearing that, but you can't be yelling at people, attacking them verbally because they're a Muslim or because they're a Jew or because they're a Christian or none of the above. So there's another element there beyond just with words. But when it's a foreign element funding these or supporting things, that is a serious issue. And by the way, Joy, it's as old as the Republic. If people go back and read the Federalist Papers, there's several of them concerned about foreign influence on the American Republic, on the what will be a young republic, and deeply concerned about nefarious foreign actors trying to impact our government. They can do that directly, and they can do it indirectly in ways like described by the intelligence community in that report you referenced. So nothing new under the sun. There may be new ways that these elements are getting into or connecting with Americans. The technologies of today, I don't think were even imagined or could have been imagined in the when the Federalist Papers were written in the late 1700s. But they still understood the danger of foreign influence and the need to be ever vigilant against it. Washington talked about that also in his goodbye speech. So I think it's nothing new under the sun gives me some sense of hope, but the depth or the breadth of this gives me some sense of worry. And it's not just the Iranians. We know that the Russians are very effective at this in using social media platforms to spread misinformation, and the Chinese are in on the game too. Again, those three nodes of power that we talked about at the beginning are, in a sense, attacking our weak points or our soft spots, yes. and in affecting people who either feel disconnected from American society or angry at American society or on the margins, and then using that.
Yes.
By the way,
that's what I wanted to get. Oh, go ahead.
That going again back to the phrase "nothing new under the sun." In SC 68, which was basically the blueprint for how we were going to wage the Cold War, the Truman administration drafted it, and it guided every administration after that. It talks about the likelihood that the Soviets were going to use our own institutions against it, or try to use our own institutions against us, and we need to be aware of that, awake to that, and on guard against that. NSC 68 uses this great phrase, which is timeless. The Soviets will use every institution of our society as an instrument to stultify and turn against our purposes. And they were talking especially about mass media and mass communications at the time. And that's, digital media, social media is just the newest kind of mass communication. So it continues to happen. The key is we have to be on guard against it. It's great that the CIA put this out, and I hope that university presidents take this and use it to help protect their student populations and help promote peaceful free speech and peaceful exchange of ideas.
Yes, I was glad to see that came out in the paper as well. And I think you mentioned that in your own article here. And I wanted to get to the foreign actors are not something new under the sun, as you said.
Right.
But you talked about in your paper a growing sentiment of the free world is apathetic about freedom and oblivious to what history teaches and freedom's enemies. That is, I think, where there's a concern, more so today than maybe back when we started America.
Absolutely, and that's where there is concern, and you might start to say, at least in American experience, in American history, that is something that is maybe new, or maybe the beginning of something new and a bit worrisome, that we lack the starting point, or we as a people, as a polity, we lack the starting point or the base of agreement that America is a force for good. America is imperfect, but we're all together building a more perfect union, that it will get better as we extend and broaden the rights of all of us, and we all contribute and share responsibilities. That is something that is a worry. That does worry me, and I know it worries you. And ASCF does a great job trying to get into high schools and grade schools, I know, through various programs, these ideas of America's founding and America's uniqueness and America's greatness. That is not
That's our
a given.
Live program.
There you go. I'll give you a plug. American history. And that is not the given that it was even when you and I were teenagers, which is a long time ago, but let alone when our grandparents were, in the 1930s and 40s, in my case. That is different, and that is worrisome, because if we don't have an agreement on that we are heading in the right direction, that we are all in this together, that America is a unique and great country, good as well as great, imperfect to be sure. There's no perfect nation, but it is worthy of being defended. Its flag is worthy of respect. Its people have done great things for the world. If we don't agree on that becomes very troubling. And will we have people willing to defend us? Will we have enough people willing to defend us? Will we have a Congress that is able to make hard decisions when it's called upon to do so? Will we have presidents that recognize that America's just not another country on the UN roster between Albania and Zimbabwe? That's a worrisome thing to me when you see some of these polling numbers, which I share in that article about people just not have new generations. Basically, it seems there's to be a bit of a delineation between Generation X, which are people in their late 40s and 50s, and then the millennials and Generation Z on some of the core principles of America. The average voter has a big job to play. The most important election may not be for president; it may be for the school board. When it all comes, and that's something that I've always been taught. And it certainly is an American idea. The people closest to you, and the election closest to you, is probably the one that's most important, and the one that is furthest away. Obviously, presidents have enormous power, and I understand that, but I'm only saying that a little bit tongue-in-cheek. And when I say that the school board and city council are important elections.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, you are talking to the choir, but we are talking to our listeners too. And a lot of times they probably are asking what can I do? Write to your representative, vote for the representative that's going to represent you and what you believe.
That's right, and exactly. And don't vote only every 4 years, right? I mean, there's elections every year, and and those matter. And if it frustrates you enough, maybe you should run. And I have a friend who's doing that right now, in here in my county, and he's the father of 3, and I'm very proud of him that he's going to run for school board, and
good for him.
And good for him. And he's back to, and that goes back to education, learning. The irony is, there's never been a time in history where it's easier to learn, easier to find information. And of course, the other side of that sword is there's never been a time in history where it's easier to find false information, untruths that look like truths, or to be manipulated by sources, going back to what you said a moment ago, that are trying to affect or misinform or spread disinformation. So and that goes back to, I've talked about it with you before. That goes back to education. We have to have critical thinking. We have to be asked the questions of why or how when we read news, or when we consume news information, and that is critical to have critical thinking.
And actually, that you bring up another point there. I was reading in your article, and I thought, when you talk about the poll, you said that polling finds that a wide range of American people of all political stripes seek leaders who are fundamentally anti-democratic, that 56% of Americans want to silence the troublemakers spreading radical ideas, that 53% say Americans should do what the authorities tell us to do. And 29%.
Right, and that's a quote from that I quoted in the article from the polling, and I have the link there for those readers. And that's that to me is troubling. Obviously, it was troubling to the author of that article, which is in I believe one of the Congressional Quarterly sub magazines. I think is where I got that, NextGov, and it has the poll numbers in there. But the founders were very concerned about unchecked executive power. They were concerned about executive power. Let's be honest. They rebelled against the King of England because he was an unchecked tyrant. And so when you start to read or hear that Americans want to quiet troublemakers who spread different ideas, 53% of Americans said we should just do what authorities tell us. To Americans of all stripes are open to leaders who are committed or willing to move toward a kind of an anti-democratic approach to governance. That's really troublesome and strange and worrisome. Again, fixable, but these are warning signs, I guess you could say. And this is where I get the article in next month's article. We'll talk about it too a bit, that we shift from or connect from, I guess, the problems with the free world under assault overseas to the problems with the free world internal issues, that we need to strengthen and make sure to borrow a kind of a parallel or a metaphor from medicine, we need to make sure the body is healthy before we head outside, so we got to ensure that we're strengthening our own self and protecting ourselves against the influences of those who might be trying to pull us in a different direction that might be different than the American tradition of majority rule with minority rights, political pluralism, and the idea that all of us are created equal. We're not a blooded soil, race or religion country, that we are classically liberal country. That becomes concerning when you hear people wanting to bend toward authoritarian rule or defer to executive power.
Right. Yes.
And those poll numbers, to me, were those poll numbers surprising to you? They were surprising to me.
Very much when I read that. Wow,
above 50%. Yeah, that's a wow. And again, it's not one political party. It's not one political side of the spectrum. It's people on both sides of the spectrum. And that's, as your listeners probably know, classical conservatives and classical liberals actually are a lot alike. Whereas reactionaries, radicals, and revolutionaries are not. Those at the margins or at the extremes of the political spectrum really are pushing things that are beyond the American tradition, and it becomes worrisome when people start to be open to some of these authoritarian
I think a good
ideas.
example is the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, where a lot of people have just, and not to look down on anyone for accepting vaccines, but we kind of blindly went into this. So, you know, it was a revealing year and a half or so, wasn't it? And not just that people didn't raise questions in general. Mm-hmm. You used the term, I think, blindly a minute ago. Didn't ask, have we ever dealt with pandemics before? How do we do it in the past? It seemed as if it was a kind of collective amnesia, that we have forgotten or unlearned that we've been through these before. I always remind people that, who are older than 55, they lived through just, pandemics. There was people who were born in the 40s and 50s lived through the pandemic of 57, 58, and then there was another big pandemic in 68, 69. And the 57, 58 one had an infection fatality rate that was worse than COVID's. And so it's odd that we just didn't remember how we dealt with these things. Back to critical thinking and getting back to good education. And I think we can do it. These are correctable things. We've gotten a little bit away from the dangerous threats from our axis of autocracy, though. So. Yeah, I was just getting to the point of what you were saying about questioning. Not that we shouldn't listen to authority, but questioning authority when we say, okay, should we do these lockdowns? Are they good for us? Should we take this vaccine? What do we know about it?
Right.
And
the idea that you just should defer.
I mean.
And that was, and I hope, because so many people have said this was wrong, I hope we've learned a lesson from that, we as a whole society and as a polity. And there's obviously a right way to question authority and a wrong way. And I think it's in the American tradition to raise questions of authority. And I don't think that's a bad thing. There's a wrong way to do it. And but I think hopefully the country has learned a lesson from that. And it was a costly lesson, I'll say that much. But hopefully we've learned a lesson, and hopefully we can build some more bridges across some of these divides to handle the threats from overseas, because we have to have at least a good solid majority of us to address these threats from overseas, to have like you said, the personnel willing to man the front lines of freedom, the political will and commitment to see through a long effort that could be like the Cold War of deterrence. We definitely know, everyone should know that deterrence is expensive, but there's something more expensive than deterrence, and that's fighting a war. So these kinds of things, we got to have enough of us Americans, a critical mass to be willing to and to sacrifice at times, whether it be hopefully not life and limb, but sometimes it could be treasure, and for the good of the cause of freedom, for our own national interest.
Yes, very well said, Alan. Thank you very much. And
always good to chat with you.
I appreciate your article, and I look forward to your next one. And to our listeners, you can view all of Alan's articles at www.ascf.us. Please subscribe, comment, and share this podcast. We're on YouTube and Rumble by typing in American Security Council Foundation. We're also on Twitter and Substack, as well as Facebook and Instagram. Please consider becoming a member of the ASCF for $100 a year. That's just less than $10 a month. It includes a paid Substack subscription, which you'll see Alan Dowd's writings on, as well as our senior analyst. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, our listeners. And please join us again next time as we bring you the podcast on Peace Through Strength.